Well, here we are again. It's a Wednesday night, and this is an amateur radio class, ham radio. It's a lot of fun. It's an adventure. It's a way that you can actually communicate to other like-minded people without using the internet. You can use computers if you want to, but you don't have to. Yeah, it's still a thing, and it's I think as popular as ever. So we want to bring you along. And what we're doing here is preparing you to take your first exam, your technician class exam, to get your first amateur radio license. And you get that by passing the 35-question test. And so we go chapter by chapter from this book, the American Radio Relay League License Manual for Technician, the 5th edition, and we're going to be in Chapter 4 tonight, talking about propagation, antennas, and feed lines. And so let's go ahead and get started with Section 4.1. And before we got started tonight, actually, I was asked probably the most popular question I always get asked. How far will a radio transmit? And that's what this first section is all about. And it depends on the propagation of radio waves. And radio waves are electromagnetic waves. We'll talk about what that really means. And so radio waves may have a range. That's the distance over which that they can be received. And there's also a radio horizon. It's the distance over which two stations can communicate by a direct path. And I like this graphic. Here are two gentlemen, we'll say, 6 feet tall, and we have water in between them. So there's no trees, there's no buildings, there's no obstructions. Another website calls this the bald earth, okay? And at 6 feet tall, with radios like small VHF, UHF portables, like the TID Radio H3 that I have here with me, range is going to be at a maximum of about 7 miles. So if you see the ads, you know, oh, this radio will go 20 miles or 30 miles, here, without any obstructions, it's a maximum of about 7 miles. And with obstructions, it's going to be less. So keep that in mind. Now, radio waves, remember we said they're electromagnetic waves, and they have 3 propagation modes. Direct line of sight, also called space wave. That's from point to point. Ground wave, that's usually goes along with medium wave signals like AM radio in your car with vertical antennas, and there's a part of the radio wave that actually follows the contour of the earth. That's called the ground wave. And then finally there's sky wave. That's for shortwave or high frequency signals that tend to go up to the ionosphere, be refracted, and come back down. We're going to talk about all of that tonight. So line of sight with space wave signals, we have to be concerned about obstructions. And so if we look here at the top, let me turn on my laser pointer. So here we have a short tower here, and we're trying to get to this receiver over here, but there's a hill in the way. And so the signal will not pass through, and so there's no way to get the signal there. If, however, we build a taller tower, this is why tall towers are popular, well, then we can overcome the obstruction and have a direct path, a space wave signal from point A to point B. And the space wave is interesting because, well, if we were to shine a laser light, for example, from our transmitter location and shine it toward the horizon, well, at that point then it would go right out into space. But radio waves actually get bent slightly at the curvature of the Earth, so that they will go, now they're starting to go out into space, but they go a little bit further, slightly farther for radio frequency signals than for light because of the refraction that occurs to the radio wave. And we can use this refraction technique purposefully. If you're obstructed by a building or something in the way, and if you can point your signal at a part of that building, point it at a sharp edge. a sharp edge of a building or a mountain or whatever else can diffract, the signal such that it can curve around obstructions. So in this way, radio signals can go around barriers. All right, that radio wave, we're still talking direct path. It's coming from a transmitter. So our transmitter there is over on the left, and it's transmitting, okay, to this radio here. And the radio is getting a signal from that transmitter on the direct path, with some obstruction here, some shadowing from some vegetation, so it's going to kind of reduce the signal strength coming through. That part of that signal is coming over here to buildings over here, and it's reflecting and coming back and coming in this way. Oh, and here's another part of that radio signal is coming off of the antenna, and there's a sharp edge here, and it's being diffracted and coming back. All of those signals are coming into this radio simultaneously. But the interesting thing is that some of them are coming in phase, so they reinforce each other. And in some cases, one's coming in out of phase, so it negates one of the signals. So this is known as multi-path reception. Multi-path reception happens in all frequencies, and we'll talk more about that coming up. But knowing about reflections, knowing about diffractions can be important. So come back to me just for a second, if you would. A little story. I used to live over in Greenville County here in South Carolina. And where I lived, I was on the other side of Paris Mountain between my house and Channel 7, WSPA. Okay, you can come back to the laptop. So here's WSPA right here. Here's their transmitter. And they're transmitting, Paris Mountain. I could not get a signal to my house. All right, because what was happening is it was just being reflected off and going elsewhere. But I did find I had a directional TV antenna at my house, and TV signals are on VHF and UHF, mostly UHF anymore, and that's line of sight, direct path kind of communication. Instead of pointing my antenna toward WSPA, I pointed it toward downtown Greenville, and was able to get a reflection off of buildings in downtown Greenville and into my TV set. So in that way, I was able to use that in order to receive Channel 7, because I wanted to get some information from them. So that's just something to keep in mind. These are techniques that you can use. You have experienced multipath yourself, although you probably haven't realized it. So if you're like me, you might have a favorite radio station with the music that you kind of like, and so you're bopping along, you're driving along, and there's a stop light coming up, and so you have to slow down, and you get up to the stoplight, and the car kind of creeps forward, and you get stopped, and the radio signal goes away. What happened? And if you creep the car up maybe about a foot and a half, the radio signal's back. That's multipath. The FM broadcast band is a VHF signal. And what was happening when I stopped and lost the signal is that part of the signal was coming in and the other part was out of phase, and it was canceling the other. So in the end, you had no signal at all. But by moving the car up just a foot and a half, then I was back into a situation where I was getting reinforcing signals and I was getting reception. So multipath, it's something that affects us all the time. Now on high frequencies or short wave, we're dealing with multipath that comes from reflections off of the ionosphere, or sometimes refractions off of the ionosphere. And in this case, it causes the radio signal to vary up and down. The multipath is aiding and negating signals. You might remember old World War II movies, folks listening to shortwave radio, and you'd hear the fading of the BBC or whatever. It would come up and then it would go down in strength. That's high frequency multipath. Multipath is important at home as well with VHF and UHF repeaters. When you get your technician license, and you will, you're first radio is probably going to be one of these small HTs, and your first thing you want to do is program the radio to your local amateur radio repeaters. Repeaters, remember, you transmit to them. They have very tall antennas. They receive your signal and transmit it back out on a different frequency. So from that little radio, 5-watt radio, you can go 60, 70 miles via a repeater. But when you're at home with your little HT, you will find there's going to be a sweet spot. There's going to be a spot in your house that you can easily hear the repeater, and people on the repeater can easily hear you. But if you move just a few feet over, your signal may go away and you may not receive the repeater anymore. You're off your X. So if you hear people talking about off your X, they're not off your rocker, but you're off the spot where it's the sweet spot in your house. Keep that in mind. How old are you? Are you as old as me? Come back just for a second. So I was always interested in computers. Commodore 64 was my first computer, and I was interested in bulletin board systems. You had a phone modem, and you dial out into a BBS system, and maybe you get some news or information or whatever else. Well, at the same time as this was going on in the late 70s, early 80s, amateur radio had their own version of this called packet radio. And instead of using a telephone modem, you would actually use a terminal or a computer to connect to a box that was called a TNC, a terminal node controller, and then to a little radio. So you can come back to the laptop, if you would. Laptop, gentlemen, please. Thank you. Got to wake them up over there. So packet radio predates the internet. And back in the era of BBS systems, so you'd have your computer or even terminal, dumb terminal, talking through a TNC that would control the radio functions and go off to another packet radio station. It might be your friend down the street or on the other side of town. And with this, you could exchange data and digital messages. And digital signals also can be affected by multipath, and that's why I bring it up. Multipath interference for data signals garbles transmission. And when you have garbled transmission, well, you can imagine the error rate, or the number of errors in the signal, goes up. So multipath causes the error rate to go up with digital signals. You saw in an earlier slide, we're going through some vegetation. VHF and UHF signals are normally stronger in the winter. Why do you think? Well, it's that green stuff you see on the left. The leaves of trees and whatnot can absorb part of the radio frequency energy. And so you have to keep that in mind. I used to get internet via a wireless modem at my old house, and it was impacted by vegetation. In fact, I had to cut down some trees in order to make sure that I could have good internet from my old house. You're driving along in your car, you're on the two-way radio, and people say, hey, your signal is fluttering, your signal is picket fencing. What does that mean? Well, like the picket fence here, you see you've got fence, and then you've got a gap, then you've got fence, and then you've got a gap, or you could say signal strength goes up, and signal strength comes down, signal strength goes up, signal strength goes down. That happens with mobile stations, both on receive and transmit, where you're going by buildings, you're going by things that are reflecting, and the multipath is happening rapidly, back and forth, and so you're getting things going up and down. So if you hear somebody talking about picket fencing, it's nothing you can do about it. It's perfectly normal, and the minute you get out of that area, the picket fencing will stop. But it's signal level that fluctuates up and down as a vehicle moves along. VHF and UHF. VHF about 144 megahertz for the 2-meter band. UHF 70 centimeters, about 450 megahertz thereabouts. So the 2-meter band, that means the wavelength. Come back to me just for a second if you would. For the 2-meter band, the wavelength of a full radio signal is 2 meters. I can't go that far, but over 6 feet. Is the wavelength of one radio wave, whereas 70 centimeters is more about this size. So when we talk about wavelength and building penetration, What do you think is going to get inside a building easier? Well, take a look at the window here on the laptop, and you'll see that a 70 centimeter signal probably can fit through the window and without obstruction or whatnot, whereas 2 meter signals would be impeded probably by the construction of the building. So UHF signals typically have better penetration. All right, it's story time. Story time with Gary. So back in the day, one of my early jobs after I'd graduated from Central Michigan University is I went to work for a local PBS television station up in Michigan. And PBS was innovative because up until that time, network signals had always been transmitted via leased lines, via microwave hops. So NBC, ABC, CBS, all of their signals were on AT&T long lines microwave systems getting signals to the station. Well, that's a lot of money. And PBS, being funded the way they were, was trying to, save money. And they determined that the initial capital outlay would pay for itself in a matter of years if they instead went the satellite route. And so they put up antennas like this. This is a 9.2 meter satellite antenna and for C-band. Then we're able to not only receive one network signal, but when I was working for them, there were 4 network signals on the satellite that were coming down to stations, plus some order wire and some other data signals and things like that. So PBS was the first, and other broadcasters, broadcast networks, said, hey, we want to do the same thing, because that's making a lot of sense. We don't want to pay AT&T all that money. So NBC did it, and my next job after working for the PBS station was to work for the local NBC TV affiliate. And so they put up their network as well shortly after PBS did. Note the size of the antenna here, though. It's about 4.6 meters, much smaller. NBC chose to use the KU band instead of C band. And here, the wavelength of KU band signals is about 1.6 to 2.5 centimeters. Very small. And while PBS had really great reliability on their satellite system, the C-band system, NBC came to find out about something that we want to point out here: rain fade. The size of raindrops or groups of raindrops would approximate the wavelength of the signals that were trying to be transmitted from their uplink, which I think was in New Jersey, and we were receiving in Michigan. So a big rainstorm in Michigan would kill us, would take away our network signal completely. Even worse, if they had a big rainstorm in New Jersey, it would take out the entire network for the entire United States. Ay, 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 ay. And you see the same thing if you at home have Dish Network or Direct TV with a satellite antenna outside. Those are also KU band, and you can experience, if you've got a heavy rainstorm, that for microwave signals like this, you can block the signal completely. When you're taking the test, we normally talk about, you're going to have a choice of 4 answers, A, B, C, or D. One of them is going to be the right answer, and the other 3 we call distractors. So this is just a sample test that I just grabbed from some places. It has nothing to do with ham radio. But I want to point out, they threw us a curveball. They did a distractor in the question. So all of that I gave you information on right now about rain fade and whatnot, they ask this: what are the effects of fog and light rain on the 6 and 10 meter bands? All right, think about this. The wavelength of one signal is 6 meters wide. There's no way I can go that far. Or 10 meters, that's 33 feet. No, we're not going to get there. There's no effect. So that's a distractor question. Rain has no effect on 6 and 10 meter wavelength signals because they're too large, they're too long to be impacted by water molecules, unlike the microwave signals that we looked at earlier. I got involved in radio largely listening to medium wave signals at night. Listening to stations from New York City or Chicago. I was up in Michigan at the time. And it was really cool to hear these really distant stations. And we in amateur radio, we don't talk about us being on the medium wave bands, but we are. The 160 meter band can be considered a medium wave band because the band starts at 1.8 megahertz, just above the top end of the broadcast band, which is 1.7. And so I recently, with Bruce's help over here, put up an antenna for 160 meters. And it doesn't look like either of these, but it's a big antenna with 3 legs of about 136 feet on each leg. And with these types of antennas, especially if they're vertically polarized, which mine is, then we have to be aware of the ground wave. Remember, I told you there were 3 types of wave: the direct wave, the ground wave, and sky wave. And so for medium wave signals, this is where it really comes into play. With antennas that are vertically oriented, we'll talk about vertical polarization coming up, they stick up from the ground rather than being horizontal. There is a significant ground wave component to that signal. And so during the day, that's how people listen to AM radio or medium wave radio. They listen using the ground wave, which can go out about 60, 70 miles, depending on the power levels and whatnot. There is a sky wave component, but during the day, that's absorbed by the ionosphere. We'll talk about that here in a second. So with medium wave signals with vertical antennas, ground wave comes into play. And ground wave not only follows the contour of the Earth, but it goes past the curvature because the signals are actually kind of bent along the surface of the Earth. And you can actually see them kind of tilting over as they go out further and further. So that's ground wave propagation. For 80 meters and up, very minimal ground wave component. By the time you get up to the 20 meter band, there's very little ground wave component. Now, there is sky wave. And sky wave uses the layers of the atmosphere, actually the outermost layer of the atmosphere. So if we look here, here's our Earth, the troposphere, the stratosphere, the mesosphere, and up here at the very top is the ionosphere. And it's the ionospheric layers that are ionized by the rays of the sun during the day that changes the ionosphere's characteristics, its electrical characteristics. So that during the day, here's daytime, here's the sun is out, the F layer is ionized, but also below it is the E layer and the D layer. These are all in the ionosphere, but they're distinct layers of the ionosphere. When the sun is out, all of these are energized, and what happens is skywave signals from an AM transmitter, in this case, coming up is entirely absorbed by the D layer, primarily. And I call it the dead layer, because it kills long distance reception of medium wave signals during the day. That's why you can't listen to long distance AM stations during the day, because of the layers of the ionosphere, specifically the D layer. Whereas at night, okay, we got the moon out now, there's no ionization except for the very top layers of the ionosphere, the F layers. And here, the skywave component of the AM radio transmitter is not absorbed. It's actually refracted back from the ionosphere and can go thousands and thousands of miles away. So know about the layers of the ionosphere. During the day, we have the F layers, F1 and F2, the E layer, and the D layer. Whereas at night we'll have the F layer, which is what we talked about for skywave propagation, and then there's something called the E layer, and the E layer is a funny old layer. People don't really know all about it yet. It's made up of, we believe, gaseous clouds of energy that come and go sporadically. Hence, we call it sporadic E propagation. And it's most used on 10-meter signals and above, so up into VHF, where you can actually get long-distance transmissions intermittently by bouncing signals off of the ionospheric clouds, the E-layer clouds, and have them come down. So I've done E-layer voice communication from South Carolina to California, for example. You can't do it consistently, but when it happens, it's kind of magic. That was on the 6-meter band, or 50 megahertz. So know about E-layer and sporadic E propagation. When you're transmitting signals up to the ionosphere, there's an interesting characteristic. It's called the critical frequency. Below the critical frequency, and this changes, by the way, from day to day, depending on conditions and the sun, et cetera, but below the critical frequency, refraction of signals occurs. So if you're below, we have it marked here as 100 megahertz. If you're below 100 megahertz, here's 5 megahertz, or here's 20 megahertz, they'll be refracted by the ionosphere and come back down to Earth and can be received on Earth. Whereas if you go over whatever that critical frequency is at that point in time in the day, then the signal will maybe be partially refracted but still go out into space. VHF and UHF signals are very rarely refracted by the ionosphere. In fact, the rule is that they go out into outer space. That's why NASA and other space programs use UHF primarily to communicate with space stations, because UHF will go right up through the ionosphere without any refraction and without any degradation. So below the critical frequency, refraction occurs, it'll come back down to Earth. Above the critical frequency, it will go out into space. But we do love the ionosphere. The ionosphere is what makes the magic of long-distance radio transmission possible. And we're primarily talking about the high-frequency bands. But for VHF, there's also an impact depending on the season and whatnot. And you can get some long-distance communication. The high-frequency bands, like 15 meters, 10 meters, 6 meters, which is VHF, are all impacted by the sun. The sun generates sunspots, which are literal dots on the sun, and the sunspot cycle is 11 years long. And so radio propagation gets really bad, then gets really good, then gets really bad again, then gets really good in an 11-year cycle. Look at this one. Wow, that was back in the 1950s. That must have been awesome radio propagation. We are here. This is where our sunspot cycle is right now, and we're on the downward slope. We're about maybe 5 years away from having another minimum, and then we'll start coming back up again. How high up will the next one be? No one really knows. But it all has to do with the sunspots. So here are sunspots, using a spectrograph looking at the sun. Here's during one of those troughs where there's no sunspots on the sun. So the 6 meter and 10 meter bands, they benefit from sunspots. And both 6 meters and 10 meters are what we call daytime bands. And so when you've got the sun out at high noon with lots of sunspots, that's when long distance propagation is possible on 6 and 10 meters. At nighttime, not so much. But daytime on 10 meters, for example, 28 megahertz, what happens is that signals will come out and be refracted by the F2 layer, also sometimes by the F1 layer, and actually signals will go, thousands and thousands of miles away. Come on back to me just for a second. I always say that amateur radio operators are opportunists. We take advantage of propagation openings, sporadic E. Yeah, I'm going to get my signal in there while I can. The communications industry, however, that's not what they're all about. They're about reliability. And back when I used to work for the Voice of America, we needed a communications link between a receiver site that we had on a mountaintop in Baguio City in the Philippines, and we needed to get signals down reliably to a transmitter site on the coast at Poro Point. And the Philippines telecommunications systems at the time were not very reliable, so VOA installed their own tropospheric communications system. And so if you look at the laptop there, you'll see these antennas. They look very much like satellite antennas, right? Except they're pointed at the horizon, or pointed downward actually. And they're being used for a reliable link up to 300 miles. Typically 300 megahertz or thereabouts. It's before satellites, and VOA used this in the Philippines to get signals from, here was the receiver site in Baguio, and down to Poro Point, which was a transmitting station. So tropospheric communications, one of the ways that it can be used is for reliable VHF and UHF communications up to 300 miles using thermal layers. So when you hear tropospheric, think thermal, think tropical. We experience it here, even in South Carolina, with temperature inversions. Sometimes, the normal conditions are that you're going to have warmer air down toward the ground and colder air the higher you go up. But it can be, because of weather systems and whatnot, that you can have cold air at the bottom, a warm air layer in the middle, and cold air up top. And this actually becomes a trough in which radio frequency signals can be carried hundreds, if not thousands of miles away. So usually twice a year during the equinoxes, you will actually sometimes on the radio repeaters hear signals coming in from New Hampshire. It's coming down via tropospheric ducting, also called thermal inversion. So that's another propagation mode to be aware of. When you're on high-frequency radio, shortwave radio, you'll have limited capabilities with your technician license as far as the frequencies you can use. But the general class, they get really into HF transmission. Some of your signal is going to go up, be refracted by the ionosphere, and come back down thousands of miles away. But some of it gets reflected back down to an intermediate area here. We call this the skip zone. But still there can be reception because of this reflected signal that comes back down. It's not very strong, it's kind of fluttery, and it's called backscatter. Just be aware of that. Hams are crazy people. Like I told you, we're opportunists, and we're always looking for a way to get signals through. Who would have ever thought of bouncing signals off of a meteor's tail? But meteor scatter is something that hams do. The 6-meter band is primarily suited for this because the wavelength matches the nominal size of meteor trails. And so when we know that there's going to be a flight of meteors coming down, and there are regular schedules for this, you can transmit up to where you believe the meteors are going to be, and another ham can be also listening in that same direction, and you can get two-way communication going via meteor scatter. That's kind of funny, but it's not as freaky as the next one. So we've had some disturbances in the Earth's magnetic field recently caused by activity on the sun. We know this because that's when you can see the aurora borealis in the northern hemisphere, aurora australis in the southern hemisphere. That's when the sun is spewing out particles and things to impact the magnetic field on the Earth. And so most of the time, aurora is not good for radio. For high-frequency radio at high latitudes, it can actually cause radio blackouts. But aurora can also be used by ham radio operators. You can actually point your antennas, for us here in the northern hemisphere, point your antennas north when the aurora is going to be around, and then make a contact. So let me turn off, let me turn on original sound here so you can hear all of this on Zoom. And let's play some aurora. It's going to sound kind of freaky, don't be freaked out, but this is actual contacts. Oops, let me do this.
5 and 8, Aurora. 5 and 8, Aurora. Fox, November 3-2. Call is Kilo Charlie 2, Whiskey Lima.
QSL, nice to see you again, and beautiful signal on the Aurora, 5 and 9 Aurora here, 59 Aurora, Fox, Norway, 25, over.
QSL, Kevin, you're also 5973, thank you.
73 and good luck. Victor Echo 3 Echo November. I'm going to QSY up 5.
He's tuning his radio.
Okay, QRZ, Victor Echo 3 Echo November. Victor Echo 3 Echo November. QRZ. Alpha 1 Tango Tango, nice to see you, nice signal. 5 and 7, 57 Aurora, Fox, Norway, 25, Fox November 25, over.
Yeah, Alpha, copy 5-8 Aurora. And 2 Foxtrot, November 33, FS 33, over.
QSL, thanks for Fox November 33 and enjoy the opening. There were a lot of strong signals out there. Alpha 1 Tango Tango, Victor Echo 3, Echo November 73.
So the signals have varying signal strength and somewhat high distortion. And that person wasn't talking in a raspy voice. He was talking in his regular voice, but it was the Aurora reflection that was making it sound like that. I mentioned sporadic E earlier. It can be for 15 meters and up, but 10, 6, and 2 meters are the likely bands. That's where you're using those gaseous clouds to intermittently be able to get long distance signals. There are websites where you can track the effects, or what we believe to be the sporadic E layers, that can kind of clue you into where propagation might be able to take place. We won't go further into that. So we mentioned the critical frequency earlier. There are a couple other frequencies that you just need to be aware of. The LUF and the MUF. Lowest usable frequency, maximum usable frequency. So maximum usable frequency is that frequency that can be used from point A to point B, from New York to London, let's say. And it can be calculated based on the current, at that moment, ionospheric conditions and other solar conditions, etc. There's software that will tell you what the maximum usable frequency is from those 2 points. There's also a frequency called the lowest usable frequency, that if you go any lower than that, there's no way you're going to get propagation between those points. So it varies by time of day and the direction of the signal. The higher ham bands, 10 meters, etc., will work better during the day for distant transmissions. The lower ham bands, 160 meters, 80 meters, only have a chance for long distance transmission at night, but they're independent of sunspot numbers. So when we have that sunspot minimum coming up in 5 years, we're going to probably want to be operating on the low bands because we can still get long distance communication on those bands as well. And there's another propagation mode, something called gray line. It's the twilight region between light and dark. If you've got the sun up over here and it's light here and it's dark on the other part of the earth, well, this band right here is called the gray line. In this case, it's the blue line. And it's interesting because stations here can have an advantage by propagating signals through the gray line to, let's say, stations here in the western part of the United States. And so the Earth is always rotating, so that gray line is always moving, and there are maps that you can get that can track the gray line and tell you when you might be able to utilize that to your advantage. Well, Gary, I just want to communicate, okay? But you might want to communicate to a long-distance location. And your tax dollars at work and the organization that I used to work for, the Voice of America, the coverage area prediction software that we developed for our own transmitters to try to figure out what frequencies and bands we should use to get signals into certain locations, it's available to you online. VOA cap online, and also you can download it's in the public domain now, the software as well, and run it locally on your own computer. They can tell you what frequency bands and what times of day from your location, given your antennas, your transmitter power, it's likely for you to be able to get a signal into another location. We talked about the sun. Space weather has a huge impact on radio frequency propagation on the Earth, and there are a lot of online resources. DX Heat, spaceweather.com, Solar Ham, all of these are utilized to help you determine, how you can get your signal from point A to point B. And did you know we have our own weather woman? The Space Weather Woman. spaceweatherwoman.com. Dr. Tamitha Skov, who is also a ham, but she's also a rocket scientist, or, astrophysicist, or whatever you want to call it. She knows solar weather. And if you go to her website there, her YouTube channel, you can actually get a weather forecast, which includes the forecast for amateur radio band propagation. So just want to mention her. All right, you made it through section 4.1. Let's answer some questions. So remember our 3-second rule. We'll try to wait 3 seconds and then come up with the answer. You can unmute in the Zoom classroom. So why do VHF signal strengths sometimes vary greatly when the antenna is moved only a few feet?
Charlie.
We see that? Charlie, multipath propagation cancels or reinforces signals. And why is the effect of vegetation on UHF or what is the effect of vegetation on UHF and microwave signals?
Bravo.
Bravo.
Absorption, yes. The leaves will absorb the signals and reduce the strength. And what is the meaning of the term picket fencing?
Bravo.
Bravo.
Yeah, rapid flutter on mobile signals due to multipath propagation. And what weather condition might decrease range at microwave frequencies?
Charlie.
Charlie.
Yeah, microwave, KU band, precipitation, rain fade. And what is a likely cause of irregular fading of signals propagated by the ionosphere?
Delta.
Everybody see that? Yeah, it's random combining of signals arriving via different paths. Sometimes they're reinforcing each other, sometimes they're negating each other. And what effect does multipath propagation have on data transmissions?
Delta.
Yep,
Delta.
error rates are likely to increase. And which region of the atmosphere can refract or bend HF and VHF radio waves?
Charlie.
It's the top one, it's the ionosphere. Yep, you're right. And what is the effect of fog and rain on signals in the 10-meter and 6-meter bands?
Bravo.
Bravo.
That's the distractor question. Yeah, there's little effect. And why are simplex UHF signals rarely heard beyond their radio horizon?
Charlie.
Charlie.
Yeah, UHF signals, they go out into space. They're usually not propagated by the ionosphere. And what is a characteristic of HF communications compared with communications on VHF and higher frequencies?
Charlie.
Yeah, long distance ionospheric propagation is far more common on HF. And what is a characteristic of VHF signals received via auroral backscatter? You heard it.
Bravo.
Yep, they're distorted, and the signal strength varies considerably. And which of the following types of propagation is most commonly associated with occasional strong signals on the 10, 6, and 2-meter bands from beyond the radio horizon?
Bravo.
The key word there is occasional, so that's sporadic, so that's sporadic E. And which of the following effects may allow radio signals to travel beyond obstructions between the transmitting and receiving stations?
Alpha.
Alpha.
Knife edge diffraction. Find a sharp point that you can beam your signal to. And what type of propagation is responsible for allowing over-the-horizon VHF and UHF communications to ranges of approximately 300 miles on a regular basis?
Alpha.
Alpha.
It's what VOA did in the Philippines, tropospheric ducting, a tropo system. And what band is best suited for communicating via meteor scatter?
Bravo.
Bravo.
6 meters.
Bravo.
And what causes tropospheric ducting?
Delta.
Delta.
Temperature inversions in the atmosphere. And what is generally the best time for long-distance 10-meter band propagation via the F region?
Alpha.
Yeah, alpha.
From dawn to shortly after sunset, so daytime, during periods of high sunspot activity. Yeah. So which of the following bands may provide long-distance communication via the ionosphere's F region during the peak of the sunspot cycle?
Alpha.
Alpha.
Yeah, the hot bands are 10 meters for sure and sometimes 6. Yep. And why is the radio horizon for VHF and UHF signals more distant than the visual horizon?
Charlie.
It is, Charlie. It's the atmosphere that refracts radio waves slightly. You're doing great. All right, antenna and radio wave basics. So the most common type of antenna that you will see is this one, a horizontal dipole antenna. I always have to hold my arms out when I do this, but it is an antenna that is fed at the center. We have coaxial cable here feeding it. And one half of the coax, the shield, let's say, goes to one antenna. And this is a quarter of a wavelength long. And the center of the coax goes out to another side that goes another quarter of a wavelength. There are insulators here and here. Those are necessary because it's a high voltage point. There's also an insulator here to keep the two separated. So this is, it's a quarter wavelength, plus a quarter wavelength is a half of a wavelength. A half wave dipole antenna is the most basic. And it's the fundamental building block of other antennas that we'll be talking about as well. So we mentioned that radio waves are electromagnetic waves. They're made up of two components, an electric field and a magnetic field. And the electric field and magnetic fields are 90 degrees opposed to each other. So this is showing you the direction of propagation, and from left to right. The electric field is going vertical here, and the magnetic field is going horizontal. Well, and here's an animation that shows it as well. They are at right angles with each other, the electrostatic and the electromagnetic fields. And antenna polarization, when we say an antenna is, we're talking about how is it polarized? It corresponds to the electric field. So in this case, it's vertically polarized. Antenna polarization corresponds to the electric field, and that also corresponds to the physical orientation of the antenna. So here we have it going from left to right. That's a horizontally polarized antenna. Here we have it going up and down. This is a vertically polarized antenna. So for these car antennas, what do you think? Are these horizontally or vertically polarized?
Horizontal.
No. What else? Vertical, because they're vertical. They're up and down.
Okay.
Yeah, they're up
I was
and down.
looking at the big one.
So these guys are vertically polarized antennas. And so signals coming from VHF, UHF, mobile radios and whatnot are typically vertically polarized. Radio repeaters are typically vertically polarized. But if you wanted to work weak signals from long distance away and you didn't want to be interfered with by these guys, well, how should you orient your antenna at home to reject these signals? And the answer is to use horizontal polarization for weak signal VHF and UHF. And that's what happens. So for VHF, UHF weak signal work, the standard is you have a horizontally polarized antenna, whereas for mobile and HTs and things like that, you use vertically polarized antennas. The phenomenon has been known for quite a while that there's a lot of isolation between the two polarizations, and satellite manufacturers and receiver manufacturers in Europe, for example, where I have the most experience, they knew this, and so for satellites they would have signals that were vertically polarized and signals that were horizontally polarized using overlapping frequency ranges, and in a low noise block converter down on your own satellite dish, they would have a vertical probe and a horizontal probe. You can't see it as we're looking at the end on here. And they're quarter wavelength long at the frequencies that you're involved. And these are the receiving elements in a low noise block converter. You could have isolation of between 100 and 1,000 times between the two. So it allowed satellite companies to actually increase their capacity by using horizontal versus vertical polarization. And it's important on VHF and UHF, as we talked about there. Now, for HF, when we're using the ionosphere for refraction, it's not so important. With a transmitter here, you're going to send up a signal. Let's say we start with a horizontally polarized dipole antenna. It's going to go up to the ionosphere. It's going to be refracted. But when it's refracted back down, the polarization is actually tumbled. It's actually got both horizontal and vertical components. It's said to be an elliptical wave that comes down. And so with high frequency, short wave, 3 to 30 megahertz signals, you can use either horizontal or vertical, and they should work. Now, I will point out there have been occasions, and I've had this myself. I have vertical and horizontal antennas here, and I had a South American signal. I don't remember which band now, and I could not hear him on my horizontally oriented antennas. But when I went to the vertical, he was a Q5 copy. He was wonderful. So that was a case of ionospheric propagation that was sending me a vertical signal and not a horizontal component. That was a weird thing, but know that that happens. But generally the rule is that both horizontal and vertically polarized antennas can be used for high frequencies. All right, going to go all theoretical on you right now. A point source antenna, also known as an isotropic radiator. It's a point in space where energy is being transmitted out from it, equal in all directions, up, down, left, right. You can't build these. Why? You can't build them on Earth anyway because of reflections, because of reflecting off of the Earth or off buildings or whatnot. So this is a theoretical concept. But engineers use this, that if we had an isotropic antenna that was perfect in every way, that this would be our reference. Okay? And then we can talk about other antennas in comparison to this. And when they talk about other antennas, they typically talk about antenna's gain. And by design, the antenna's pattern can be changed to provide more signal in certain directions. All right, so I'm going to throw you guys a curveball here. I want to go over to the green screen, or over here to the wall. Wake Bruce up over there. Am I there? I'm there! Yay! All right, so let's see if this works. Oh, I got tape all over it. Okay, two things while I'm over here. So we've got a meter stick here. I'm going to put the meters out toward you so we can kind of measure. And here's an antenna. And it's the pattern of the antenna. And it's pretty much omnidirectional. If you look at the top of it, it's a big circle. And so the signal goes out, over to here and over to here, but a lot of it goes up into space. Okay, well, this is no good, unless you want to talk to people up above. But if we could control the pattern of this antenna, so let's say we have 100 watts of power, air, inside the balloon, but we could control the pattern of the antenna by squashing it down. I don't want to go too far or blow it up. But notice now, down at the bottom, we come out farther to the left and to the right and to everywhere. By controlling where the energy is dispersed, that controls the gain of the antenna. So the isotropic, might be, just a point in space, but this is going to have gain over an isotropic, and we're not sending so much energy up into space, we're getting it back down low where it's important to be able to talk to people over here or to talk to people over here, for example. So that's what we're doing when we have gain antennas. We're not amplifying anything, we're just controlling the power density and where it goes to the desired location. Also, while we're over here, the 2-meter band, we said that the most common antenna that we use is a half-wave dipole antenna. So for the 2-meter band, half of a wavelength would be 1 meter. Here we have a meter stick. Okay? Looky here. Here is a 2-meter horizontal dipole that I built. It works. This is horizontally polarized, but if I turn it this way, then it would be vertically polarized. I'll come back here. This is vertically polarized. This is horizontally polarized. And we're going to be talking about a quarter wave antenna in a minute. I want to show you how you get to a quarter wave. So here's our half-wave dipole. What happens if, okay, so I know this is the driven element, the white. What happens if if we just bend it? And we added some more going out in different, this then becomes a quarter wavelength high with radials. We call them radials or counterpoises. This works. This is a quarter wave antenna. So we'll talk more about that in just a second. All right, we can go on back. So when we're controlling an antenna and we want to get more gain, we can add more elements. And a beam antenna, also known as a Yagi antenna, is an antenna that has gain over a standard dipole. So here is a Yagi antenna. It's vertically oriented. They're up and down here. It's got a half wavelength driven element right here. It's got a reflector element back behind it to reflect some of the energy, and then it's got some director elements in the front that help direct the beam so that energy is not going up and down, it's not going to the back, but it's primarily going forward. So this is a gain antenna, also known as a beam antenna. The Yagi antenna is named after Mr. Yagi, who was a professor at a Japanese university. We really should call it the Yagi Uda antenna because it's actually his assistant, Mr. Uda, that did all the work. But Mr. Yagi got all the credit. You can find the true story there at that URL. So here is a 6-meter Yagi antenna. We're going to say it's vertically polarized. There's a half wavelength element here in the middle. That is the driven element. It has a reflector behind it that is about 5% longer than the driven element. And it's got a director element up forward, which is about 5% shorter. And so in this case, it's direction over here. This is where it's receiving and transmitting. And this antenna has gain over a standard dipole antenna. It has gain in transmit. It has gain in receive, which is why there's an old ham radio axiom. It's always better to improve your antenna than it is to improve your radio, because you can get more gain here on transmit and receive. This is vertically oriented, but you could also have horizontal Yagis, and you can have them for the high frequency bands as well. They get bigger, but again, here's a high gain TH3 Junior that's used for 20 meters, 15 meters, and 10 meters. And when we're measuring a gain of these antennas against our isotropic, our theoretical antenna, or we can measure it against a dipole antenna, we typically do it in a logarithmic relationship, and we typically do it using decibels. So there's only 3 decibel values that you need to kind of know about for the class, but it's always nice to know. 1 dB is about a 20% increase. But here's one you need to know. 3 dB is a 2 times increase. So if your antenna had a 3 dB gain, that means that instead of the effective radiated power being 100 watts going out, it would be 200 watts. Or a 6 dB is 4 times gain. And 10 dB is 10 times gain. And you can also have them as loss as well. So if you lose half, then that's a 3 dB loss, or it could have 6 dB loss, a minus 6 dB, or minus 10 dB would be 10 times loss. They correspond to these kind of voltage microvolt readings coming into a receiver antenna. And most receivers have S meters, whereas each one of the S units we say is about 6 dB. So it takes 4 times the power to get your receive antenna S meter to move over 1 unit. Here's an omnidirectional pattern. If I kept pushing on that balloon, we might get down to something like that. We're looking, it's a vertically polarized antenna at the center there, and it's a donut shape all the way around. The Yagi, or directional beam antenna, has a pattern that looks something like this. This is the forward lobe. This is where the maximum amount of energy is here. Notice 12 dB gain. That's a lot. It's got some signal going to the back, but much less. So that's the front to back ratio. It's got some minor side lobes here, but then it's got some really good nulls here as well, where it's not receiving or transmitting signals as well. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about a directional antenna. That we have the main lobes, the side lobes, the nulls, and then the front to back ratio. When I got started teaching the technician class, I taught it to a group of preppers, and they were always asking me about this antenna. So when a dipole antenna is too low, normally you want it to have it be a half of a wavelength above ground. So for a 20-meter antenna, you want to have it at least 10 meters up in the air, and to get the pattern to form nicely. But if you start bringing that antenna down closer and closer and closer to the ground, the antenna azimuth starts going up and up and up and up until the eventual, you get something in the extreme called a near vertical incident sky wave, or NIVIS antenna, also known as a cloud warmer, where most of the energy that's coming off of the antenna is going up to the ionosphere and coming right back down again. Why would you want to do that? Well, this is actually a very popular antenna in the military, a low dipole antenna that's shooting most of its energy straight up, because if you're in a mountainous region, VHF and UHF can't go through the mountain. But if you can get up to the ionosphere and come back down again on the other side of the mountain, then for tactical communications, this is important. So this is a NIVIS antenna, in case you ever hear anybody ask about it. All right, let's answer some questions, and then we'll take a break. What happens when antennas at opposite ends of a VHF or UHF line of sight radio link are not using the same polarization? What do you think?
Alpha.
Bravo.
Bravo. Received signal strength is reduced, yes indeed, by 20 to 30 dB if you're not using the same polarization. And which of the following results from the fact that signals propagated by the ionosphere are elliptically polarized?
Bravo.
Yes, either vertical or horizontally polarized antennas may be used for transmission or reception.
This is the one where I was a little bit confused on that last question.
Yeah?
Is that one of the questions that you call the diversion questions?
No, this is one where I said that you in general can use either a vertical or horizontally polarized antenna for HF, but in my case, I had an instance where I only could use a vertical antenna, so it's not universally true, but it's generally true. But no, this is not a distractor question.
All right.
So what is the relationship between the electric and magnetic fields of an electromagnetic wave?
Delta.
Delta.
We say they're orthogonal or at right angles. And what property of a radio wave defines its polarization?
Alpha.
Yeah, the orientation of the electric field. And what are the two components of a radio wave?
Charlie.
Yep, electric and magnetic fields. A lot of questions asking the same thing. You won't get all of these questions on your test, but you want to see them all. So which decibel value most closely represents a power increase from 5 watts to 10 watts?
Bravo.
See that? 3 dB is times 2. And which decibel value most closely represents a power decrease from 12 watts to 3 watts?
Charlie.
Charlie indeed, minus 6 dB. And which decibel value represents a power increase from 20 watts to 200 watts?
Alpha.
Yep, 10 times 10 dB. Those are the 3 that I want you to know. All right, so what is antenna gain?
Charlie.
It is the increase in signal strength in a specified direction compared to a reference antenna. That reference antenna could be the isotropic or it could be a dipole. All right, ladies and gentlemen, you've earned it. Let's take 5 minutes, get up and move around and stretch, and we'll come back and complete section 4. And we are back, and there we go. Get me organized there. We're having a nice discussion during the break there with the folks in the Zoom classroom about multipath and interference and things where you're going, oh, that's why that was happening. So yeah, the practical things coming along. All right, let's continue on because I want to get you out of here early if we can tonight. Section 4.3 has to do with feed lines and standing wave ratio. And if you were ever involved in CB radio, standing wave ratio was always a big point of contention and comment. So transmitting system parts all have what we call nominal impedances. So a transmitter or transceiver is going to have a typical output impedance of about 50 ohms. You're going to feed it into coaxial cable typically, which is going to have typically 50 ohm impedance, although there are other types of cables that have other impedances as well. And then your antenna, we want that to be 50 ohms if we can get it there. And impedance matching between all of these parts provides for the maximum transfer of power. That's why we are so concerned about impedance matching. And if you remember, we talked about just briefly that impedance is the sum of a resistance and a reactance, either a capacitive reactance or an inductive reactance. And the two together make up what we call impedances. So feed line impedances, the thing from your transmitter out to the antenna is called the feed line. Coaxial cable, the most popular, the most common is 50 ohms. You can get something called air insulated hard line, which is a 50 ohm or 75 ohm. We'll talk more about that. There's ladder line or twin lead. If you're old enough, remember the TV antennas they used to put up with the twin lead that came down? That's what we're talking about here, 300 ohms or 450 ohm cables. These do have practical benefits in some cases, although they're not as popular anymore. So here's what they look like. Here's the twin lead, the 300 ohm that I was talking about before. Here's ladder line, which could be 450 ohms or 600 ohms, but coax. Coaxial cable is typically what most hams end up using because it's convenient. It's practical. It doesn't have to be routed away from metal objects or the eaves or things like that. Coax consists of a center conductor and an outer shield. It just works, and so most folks will use coax. So a half wavelength dipole antenna, the one we talked about before, the most common of all the antennas, has a nominal input impedance if fed at the center of about 73 ohms. So it's an excellent match for 75 ohm coax cable. It's also not a bad match for 50 ohm coax cable. So but just know that the actual feed point impedance of a half wave dipole is about 73 ohms. Now in the feed lines, if you're going to have loss because of the distance and because of things, it's going to show up as heating of the cable. Now, I'm not going to set it on fire, but I mean, that's where the energy is lost and it's converted into heat in the cable. And the number one rule of coaxial cable is keep it dry. because moisture increases power loss. So here we have a coaxial cable with a center conductor here. This one's got two shields. It's got a foil shield here, and it's got a braided copper shield out over here, and then it's got a rubber or polyethylene outer jacket. So the signal is actually a differential between the center conductor and the inner part of the shield. This is coaxial cable. Now in broadcasting, I mentioned I worked for some TV stations. We used air-insulated hard line, and you can imagine, you know, the bigger the cable, like this monster here, the more power it can handle. And the only trick with these is that, notice it's air on the inside. It's keeping the center conductor and this outer shield part, they have these little plastic inserts in there that keep them separated, but it's air. And you have to keep moisture out of that. And you do that by pressurizing the line. When you get everything all hooked up, and the connectors attached and everything, you evacuate the line, you take it down to a vacuum, and then you pressurize it with nitrogen or dry air in order to keep moisture out. Because remember, moisture is always the problem with the coaxial types of cables. Now, no matter whether you're using coax or this air-insulated hard line, here's a rule. As the frequency of operation goes up, as you increase your frequency, the power loss goes up as well in all types of cable. So it's especially important if you're going to be using UHF and above to know what kind of cable you're using and what the losses are of that cable. You don't want half of your power being dissipated as heat in your cable. If you're transmitting at 100 watts, you'd like close to 100 watts to reach your antenna. But if it's got a 3 dB loss over the distance that you're traveling there, well, then half of your power is being converted to heat in the coax. And coax cables can be big, they can be small. Note this is a RG213. It's a fairly large cable. This is about your pinky finger diameter. This is RG58, or very similar to RG8X. RG8X is a very popular cable now. But note that RG213 has lower losses at all frequencies as compared to RG58. The bigger cable is going to have lower losses at all frequencies. All right, standing wave ratio and impedance matching. We're going to try to demystify things. So we mentioned before that we want to have matched impedances, because that way we transfer all the energy to be radiated by the antenna. So the transmitter, this is our source over here, has a source impedance, ZS. The cable has a characteristic impedance, ZC. And the antenna has a characteristic impedance, ZL. And we want them all to be the same. All right, relax here just for a second and think nice thoughts. Think about waves coming in from the ocean. They're rolling in from the ocean and they're coming up against this cliff. And this discontinuity, this cliff, pushes the wave back toward the sea. That's called a rebound wave. And the same thing happens if we send energy out from our transmitter to an open circuit. There's no load connected. The energy going from left to right is being rebound or reflected back. So that is an open circuit. This is more common. This is a partial reflection, where most of the energy is going out, but some of it is coming back. And here's another. Notice the polarities of the signals that are coming back. In this case, see, it's the same polarity. There's the signal going out, see the signal coming in. Notice in this other one we looked at, it's a reverse polarity. That's the difference between a signal going into a lower impedance cable or a higher impedance load is the kind of reflection. And the worst possible cases are short circuits, which again, you notice it inverts the polarity of the reflected signal, or an open circuit where you've got no connection whatsoever, that reflects all of the power. What we're searching for, what we're trying for is this, a matched impedance where all of the energy goes out to the antenna, it's absorbed by the antenna and radiated out as electromagnetic waves, and you're traveling over thousands of miles. So that's why we want matched impedances. Now, if you have reflected waves, as we looked at before, we generate something called a standing wave. So look real closely here. The blue wave is traveling from the left to the right. That's from our transmitter to our antenna. Our antenna is a lousy match because almost an equal amplitude wave is coming back, the red wave, coming back from the left to the right. And where they add up algebraically, you see this black line going up and down and up and down, but it is not moving. It's standing. It's standing on the line. That's what we call a standing wave. This is the worst case. But notice the peak voltages of that standing wave. They're higher than the voltages of either the forward or reflected waves as well. So this is a standing wave. This is a very bad situation. What we want to do is to get no reflected power, and when we have no reflected power, then we will have no standing wave. We don't have time to look at it tonight together, but here's a URL for a YouTube video which AT&T put together, a mechanical demonstration of standing waves. And I think you'd find it fascinating if you can find that. I think it's about 20 minutes to watch it. I think you'd enjoy it. But again, if you have no reflected power, then you will have no standing waves. And a perfect situation is where your SWR, your standing wave ratio, is what we call 1 to 1. When it's 1 to 1, that's perfect. 2 to 1, under 2 to 1, that's okay. The big number is always going to be the first number, by the way. 3 to 1 is a danger zone. You got to watch out. And how do we know? Well, we use meters. A standing wave ratio meter can be an external meter like this one, or it could be a meter that's built into your radio. Most radios nowadays have ability to tell you what the SWR is, and you want it to be as low as possible. 1 to 1 is the best. Now, so here we have an inexpensive SWR meter, and it's installed between the transmitter output and the antenna feed line in your ham shack. So you use it there, and in this case you have to manually calibrate it to full scale, and then you can read SWR. There are all sorts of different kinds of SWR meters. The LP100A there, that's a pretty expensive one, but it's a very reliable one. Others for VHF and UHF. Not all SWR meters are created equally, so you got to know, is this very accurate? Is this for VHF? Is this for UHF? What kind of power levels can it handle? So just keep that in mind when you're considering getting a meter. Directional watt meters, you'll see these at ham fests, for example. They also can be used to calculate standing wave ratio. There are actually 2 ports on this guy. You can only see one. Here's one. This is what I call the goes in-a, and over here on the other side is the goes out-a. And signal is fed from your transmitter on the goes in-a, goes out-a to the antenna. And you see this little slug right here. You see there's an arrow on this slug, and it's pointed from left to right. So this is reading power in the forward direction. You take this slug and you turn it 180 degrees, and then you can read power be reflected back from the antenna. And then on the back of the unit, there's usually a table where you can calculate what the standing wave ratio is from the forward power and reflected power. Perfect, we said, is 1 to 1. Acceptable is a 2 to 1 ratio. Danger is above 3 to 1 for solid state transmitters. Older tube type transmitters back in the day, standing wave ratio was not all that important because they had what they called pi network output tuning, and it would compensate for this. But with solid state transmitters, we have to know about this, and we have to keep the SWR low, because if you don't, then your new radio, this is the ICOM 7300, it will reduce its own power output to save itself. If it detects a standing wave ratio above 2 to 1, for example, your 100 watt radio will become a 50 watt radio. And you don't really want that. So Now this radio has a built-in antenna tuner. It's automatic. You just push a button and it makes things all good. But you can also find manual antenna tuners that you can use for any radio. They have tuning knobs here that you can adjust, band knobs to put you in the right direction, and meters to tell you when you have it tuned up properly. What antenna tuners are doing is actually generating what we call a rebound wave. That reflected wave that's coming back from the antenna is met at the antenna tuner and sent back out to the antenna again. That's what an antenna tuner does. And on the other side of the antenna tuner is where the transmitter is, and the transmitter doesn't see that reflected power anymore, so it thinks everything is perfect. So that's what an antenna tuner is all about. And it's going to be a tune network, an L network with an inductor and capacitor, kind of like this. Or it could be the pi network like this. It looks like the Greek letter pi. Here's some questions. Which of the following should be considered when selecting an accessory SWR meter?
Alpha.
Yeah, the frequency and power level at which the measurements will be made. Is it suitable for what you want to do? You cannot use a VHF meter on HF, for example. So what reading on an SWR meter indicates a perfect impedance match between the antenna and the feed line?
Charlie.
1 to 1. And why do most solid-state transmitters reduce output power as SWR increases beyond a certain level?
Alpha.
Yeah, it's to protect the output amplifier transistors. That's power coming back that they have to dissipate as heat. And what does an SWR reading of 4 to 1 indicate in general terms?
Delta.
Yeah, an impedance mismatch. Yeah. And what happens to power lost in a feed line?
Charlie.
It's converted to heat. And what is a benefit of low SWR?
Delta.
It's not delta. I didn't
Bravo.
emphasize this, but it's reduced signal loss, because every time that signal has to go out to the antenna and come back, and then out to the antenna and back, you're losing more and more in heat in the feed line. So you're actually losing signal. So yeah. All right. What is? Was that a question?
Yeah, I was thinking that it was Charlie, the
No.
less antenna there.
No, because the antennas don't wear. They just sit there. There's no wearing involved. It's not a mechanical thing. All right. So what is the most common impedance of coaxial cables used in amateur radio?
Bravo.
Yep, 50 ohms. And why is coaxial cable the most common feed line for amateur radio antenna systems?
Alpha.
It's easy to use. It requires few special installation considerations. And what happens as the frequency of a signal in coax is increased?
Bravo.
Not Bravo.
Charlie?
Delta.
Delta. As the frequency goes up, the loss through the cable increases. It works higher than frequency, it works less efficient. All right, what can cause erratic changes in SWR? Think about this. It's erratic.
Bravo.
Bravo.
Yeah, a loose connection in the antenna or the feed line. And which of the following types of feed line has the lowest loss at VHF and UHF? What do the broadcasters use?
Charlie.
Charlie?
Charlie. They use air-insulated hard line because of its low loss. And what is standing wave ratio?
Alpha?
Alpha.
Yeah, it's a measure of how well a load is matched to a transmission line. Yay! All right, practical antenna systems. Here's what your HOA wants you to put up in your backyard. This is from the Voice of America transmitting station in Greenville, North Carolina, which sadly is now off the air. All of these antennas are on the ground, no longer exist, but this was 400 feet tall. It consisted of a series of multiple dipole antennas with a reflector screen along the back, and it had a power gain in its forward direction of 20 dB. 10 dB is 10 times. 10 times 10 is 100 times. So this had a 100-time power gain on the shortwave frequencies it was designed for. But it was built up of half-wave dipole antennas and multiples that were fed all together in phase. This is what we've talked about before, with a quarter wavelength on one side and a quarter wavelength on the other. Now, to calculate the half-wave dipole antenna's length, well, we just need to know something about meters and inches. So 1 meter is 39 inches, thereabouts. Just keep that in mind. And to calculate half-wave dipole's length in feet, and this might be a little different in the book, but this is the old formula, 468 divided by the frequency in megahertz will give you the length of a half-wave dipole antenna in feet. Now, there's a V in there, a velocity factor, and that has to do with whether you're using bare copper wire or are you using insulated wire. Insulated wire actually makes the antenna somewhat shorter. So 468 divided by the frequency in megahertz times 12 gives you a half wavelength in inches. Or 234 divided by the frequency in megahertz times 12 gives you the length of a quarter wave antenna in inches. These are some things you're going to want to ponder. Well, why do we use the half-wave dipole? Well, it has to do with its current and voltage distribution. We won't go heavy into it. We do this in the general and the extra class. But here you're seeing a center-fed half-wave dipole antenna. I is the current distribution. So the current maximum occurs at the center of the antenna. You can see the maximums are here. This is where the maximum current flows, whereas the maximum voltage of the antenna is out at the end. High voltage out here. Lower voltage here, almost zero voltage at the center. So just know that. And radiation from a dipole antenna, we're now looking down on it, and it's up and down. This is the antenna here. And so the antenna is radiating broadside, or 90 degrees to the antenna. That's the normal pattern of a dipole antenna. Same thing on reception. When E field comes in, it's being received by the dipole antenna, and it's inducing a voltage into the antenna that the receiver can pick up. And here's another look, looking overhead. Here's the axis of an antenna, now left to right, and the major portion of the energy from the dipole antenna comes that way and this way, the figure 8 pattern, broadside to the antenna. So keep this in mind, a general concept, two dipoles, one is longer than the other. What is the relationship to frequency? A longer antenna is going to be for lower frequencies. Shorter antennas are going to be for higher frequencies. It has to do with that pyramid we looked at before, that 300 over frequency in megahertz and wavelength in meters. It has to do, these are half wavelength antennas. And so if the frequency goes up, the wavelength gets smaller and vice versa. So some key concepts: the longer an antenna, the lower its resonant frequency. The shorter an antenna, the higher its resonant frequency. But an antenna is a resonant circuit at some frequency, or frequencies. In some cases, there are multiband antennas. And so we're going to look here. Here's a resonant circuit consisting of an inductance, a capacitance, and a resistance. Well, we know at resonance, the reactance of this is equal to the reactance of this, and they cancel each other out. So we're just left with the radiation resistance of the antenna. Just keep this in mind. I showed you earlier the quarter wave vertical antenna where I took that half wave dipole and just bent the bottom at 90 degrees. And here we've done the same thing, only we've added some additional radials here. This is a quarter wavelength, the vertical antenna. The length here is a quarter of a wavelength, and the length out here is a quarter of a wavelength. There are antennas, you'll see them advertised 5/8 wave antennas, and they're touted to be better than quarter wave antennas. They're better only in the sense that they squish the antenna pattern down even further, like I squished the balloon to get signal strength out a little bit lower and further out, but you do have to add a matching network inside of the antenna in order to get this to work. But just if you look in the ads, you'll see 5/8 wave. Well, what are they talking about? Well, that's what they're talking about. It has slightly higher gain than the quarter wavelength antenna. And the best location to mount an antenna on a mobile situation is the dead center of the car in order to provide the most uniform pattern so that it's not directional. Now, if you can't do that, I can't do that on my truck. I have mounted to the rear and the passenger side of my truck. My truck is actually somewhat directional. So on high frequencies, if I turn the antenna, sometimes the signal strength will come up or down depending on where things are. And you don't need to do this. This is a formula, but I want you to be aware of it. This is the resonant frequency formula. We actually don't deal with this until the extra class. But what I want to point out is resonant frequency. This is frequency in hertz, and it's 1 over, so it's a reciprocal relationship, and here we have inductance and capacitance. So if we add inductance or if we add capacitance, because it's an inverse relationship, by adding inductance or capacitance, the resonant frequency of a circuit will go down. Why am I telling you that? Why do you want to know that? Well, it's how we can have mobile antennas. Because you couldn't have a mobile high frequency antenna for 80 meters, because if it's going to be a quarter of a wavelength high, that would be 20 meters high. That's over 60 feet. You can't go driving down the highway with a 60-foot antenna. But what you can do is you can add an inductor into the antenna, and that makes the antenna appear electrically longer, or in other words, it reduces the resonant frequency of a shorter antenna by adding an L or a C. So they're called loaded antennas, and just be aware of that. We're going to circle back. Here's the Yagi and Uda antennas. We talked about them before with a driven element that's a half wavelength dipole. Here's about 5% longer, the reflector. Here's about 5% shorter, the director, and it's directional off in this direction. There's also something called the cubical quad antenna. It was invented in Quito, Ecuador, and it uses a full wavelength loop as the driven element, and then a reflector that is about 5% larger, and directors that are about 5% shorter, a cubical quad antenna. And then satellite antennas are highly directional antennas, and they have a gain of 30, 40, 50 dB depending on their size, with the various lobes as we have seen before. So if you're going to be building an antenna and putting it up, I'm going to highly recommend that you get your hands on one of these, an antenna analyzer. It can measure impedance, resonant frequency, tell you a lot of information about the antenna. This is an MFJ 259, I think is the model number. If we go over to the calculator cam, this is the one of the antenna analyzers that I use from Rig Expert. So it's got various functions up here that you can do. We'll go show standing wave ratio and say to go. And I have a test antenna up here. It's a 50 ohm load. Move it down there, you can see it. And so with that test load, the standing wave ratio is 1.04 to 1, 1.05 to 1. And you can do graphs, you can do all sorts of different things with the antenna analyzers. They have a built-in transmitter. You don't use your transmitter, very handy to have. If you don't have one, maybe a buddy has one, or your local ham club. And back to the laptop, rubber duck antennas, the things that come with HTs, just know that they're not very effective, especially inside of a car. So it's always best if you can, in a car, to get an outside antenna, maybe a magnetic mount antenna that you can bring the cable in and connect it up to the HT, and the radio will work much, much better. Connectors. The new HTs like this use SMA connectors. So here's what SMA connectors look like, these small guys here. N connectors are another connector type that's used in amateur radio. BNC or bayonet connectors are also used a lot for test equipment and things like that. And then the UHF or the PL259 is probably the most common cable connector used for radio, for HF radio certainly, and then VHF and UHF. And typically you install a PL259 by soldering both the center conductor and the shield. I gave up on this a long time ago and I moved over to crimp type PL259s. They are much, much better, much easier to use, and for me, much more reliable. I mentioned earlier the N connector. It's named after Mr. Neal of AT&T, who invented it. You notice there's a rubber gasket on the inside here. This connector is waterproof. And so it's best for use above 400 megahertz, because remember, for coaxial cable, moisture is the number one consideration. If you are going to be doing soldering, always for electronics use rosin core solder. I think it's even hard to find acid core solder anymore, but rosin core solder is what we want to use. And you want your joints, when you're all done with your soldering work, to not look like this. You want them to be shiny and smooth. These are dull, lumpy, rough with cracks. These are what we would call cold solder joints, which probably are intermittent connections, which you don't want to have. All right, last group of questions. So what antenna polarization is normally used for long-distance Morse code and single sideband contacts on the VHF and UHF bands? Weak signal.
Charlie.
We said that because we want to avoid the vertical antennas of the mobile guys, so we're going to go horizontal. And when using a directional antenna, how might your station be able to communicate with a distant repeater if buildings or obstructions are blocking?
Bravo?
Yeah, Bravo. Try to find a path that reflects. That's one way. And where should an RF power meter be installed?
Alpha.
Yeah, in the feed line between the transmitter and the antenna. And which of the following is used to determine if an antenna is resonant at the desired operating frequency? What do you need?
Bravo.
You need an antenna analyzer, much like the one you just saw. And which instrument can be used to determine SWR?
Delta.
Delta.
Of these, yes, the directional watt meter with the goes in and the goes out. And which of the following causes failure of coaxial cables?
Alpha.
Moisture is always the problem. And why should the outer jacket of coaxial cable be resistant to ultraviolet light?
Delta.
Delta?
Yeah, ultraviolet light can damage the jacket and allow water to enter, moisture. And what is the disadvantage of air core coaxial cable, that's what the broadcasters use, when compared to foam or solid dielectric types?
Charlie.
Charlie.
Yeah, you got to fill it with nitrogen or dry air. And which of the following types of solder should not be used for radio or electronics?
Alpha.
Alpha.
Acid core, yeah. It'll literally melt the PC board. So what is the characteristic appearance of cold tin lead solder joints?
Charlie.
I think I heard Charlie in there someplace. A rough or lumpy surface is what we're looking for, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And what is a beam antenna?
Charlie.
Charlie. It's an antenna that concentrates signals in one direction. And which of the following describes a type of antenna loading?
Alpha.
Yeah, that's that coil I showed you there. It's electrically lengthening by inserting inductors in radiating elements. If you go to a ham fest, and I urge you to do that just to visit, look at the parking lot and look at the antennas out there, and you'll see all sorts of loading inductors. So which of the following describes a simple dipole oriented parallel to the Earth's surface?
Bravo.
That would be a horizontally polarized antenna. It's physically horizontally polarized, and the E field, or the electric field, is also polarized in that direction. So what is a disadvantage of the short, flexible antenna supplied with most handheld radio transceivers?
Alpha?
It's very poor as far as its ability to radiate signals. That's what we mean by efficiency. And which of the following increases the resonant frequency increases the resonant frequency of a dipole antenna? How do you get it to go up in frequency?
Charlie.
You get it to go up in frequency by shortening it. They're inversely related. And which of the following types of antenna offers the greatest gain?
Delta.
Yeah, the Yagi. And what is the disadvantage of using handheld VHF transceivers with a flexible antenna inside the vehicle?
Alpha.
Alpha?
Yeah, signal strength is going to be reduced due to the shielding effect of the vehicle. That's why you need an outside antenna. And what is the approximate length in inches of a quarter wavelength vertical antenna for 146 megahertz? So I gave you the formulas. Anybody want to hazard a guess?
Charlie?
It is, Charlie, 19 inches. Very good. And what is the approximate length in inches of a half wave? Now, this is a half wavelength, 6-meter antenna, a dipole antenna, in inches.
Charlie.
Charlie, 112, indeed. 112 inches. And in which direction does a half-wave dipole antenna radiate the strongest signal?
Delta?
Delta.
Broadside to the antenna. And what is an advantage of a 5/8 wave whip antenna for VHF UHF?
Bravo?
Alpha.
Not Bravo.
Alpha.
Alpha.
It does. It has slightly more gain low down than a quarter wavelength antenna by squishing the pattern down just a little bit. And what is the major function of an antenna tuner or antenna coupler?
Alpha.
Alpha.
Yeah, alpha. It matches the antenna's system impedance to the transceiver's output impedance. And which of the following RF connector types is most suitable for frequencies above 400 megahertz?
Bravo.
Charlie.
It's Bravo, and we're talking about connectors here. And we're talking about, so Mr. Neal of AT&T, he invented the type N. It's the best for 400 megahertz and above. It's waterproof. It's also double shielded. And which of the following is true of PL259 coax connectors?
Charlie?
They're commonly used. Yeah, they're the most common. You're going to see them all over. And which of the following is a source of loss in coaxial feed lines? Read carefully.
Delta.
I said Delta.
So water intrusion, yeah. High SWR, yep. Multiple connectors in the line, yep. All of those choices are correct. And what is the electrical difference between RG58 and RG213?
Alpha.
Not alpha.
Charlie?
Charlie, RG213 has less loss at any given frequency. It's a bigger cable, it has less loss. And ladies and gentlemen, you have made it to the end of chapter 4. Before we get out of here, let me just show you my station, because people ask about, what are you doing, Gary? And so come on over to the laptop again, please. There we go. So general principles for my station, every ham station is different. Form follows function. I do have need for local communications. I am a cheapskate. So Personal safety is an issue. I'm getting older. I have to keep RF away from the house and people. That's another, we'll talk about that in Chapter 9. And susceptibility to RF interference from things in the house. So I have some dizziness now if I get up on a roof, so I can't go way high. But I want to be able to maintain whatever I put up. So two things you have to always consider: how are you going to bring power to your equipment, and how will your antenna cables exit the house? So I am very fortunate. I have two ham shacks here at the house. I have one inside my house, and I have one inside my workshop. You'll see both of them. So this is my house, and I've got 5 acres of land. This is the main house here. This is the studio and workshop. Workshop's on the first floor. Studio, where we are right now, is on the second floor. And then my storage building is out over here. You'll see that in a second as well. So this is my current station, and Marion was asking about it. My main radio right now is this. It's an ICOM IC7760. It's a 2-part unit, which has a control unit here and a main unit at a different location. I'll show you that. Got various programs running here for logging, for spotting, for controlling the radio, for my amplifier over here. These are now 4K monitors that I just recently installed. Very happy with those. And out in a storeroom off of my garage is where I have the actual radio. This is for the ICOM. This is the other half of the radio. And then my power amplifier. It's a RF Kit S. And cables come out. We should see those in a second. The reason I have this all here is because I have 240 volt power here at this location. It was difficult to get 240 volt power back where my ham shack is. So my amplifier requires 240 volts. And then the cables go out from the wall, out through a pipe that drilling through this brick on this house was unbelievably difficult. But it comes out here and goes up and over and out to my storage building where I have some of my HF antennas. Also inside the house, this is my VHF UHF station, a Yaesu FT991A. Amplifiers for 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters. And in this case, I brought the antenna cables out through MFJ sold what they called a window pass-through, which you could raise the window up and then close it back down on this and bring cables out this way. And for local communications, I use the Kenwood V71 radio to a J-pole antenna that's just mounted on the house. That works well. Can you believe it's the 1-year anniversary from Hurricane Helene? The only communications locally that we had available was on 2 meters and 70 centimeters. For long distance communications on low bands, I do recommend off-center fed dipole antennas, whether you build them or buy them. This is one from Radio Waves that I still have up, though I don't use it as much anymore because Bruce helped me put up, as I mentioned earlier, a 160 meter inverted L antenna and an 80 meter horizontal loop. Both of these are super performers, and I'm very, very happy with them based on information from this website, actually. So antennas are barely, you can see part of an off-center fed dipole wire antenna here. Yes, I have solar, and no, I don't have RF interference from it, thankfully. I do use a K4KIO hex beam for the higher frequencies, 20, 17, 15, 12, 10, and 6. Looks kind of like that. It's a 2-element Yagi is essentially what it is. Only mine is not mounted that high up. Mine is only mounted right there on top of my storage building, on top of a roof tower. It's only about maybe 25, 30 feet, but it works. And also then I've got some 6 meter antennas over here. Actually, I've upgraded that. In the workshop, I have some of my old legacy radios and my Flex, the 6600 is right there. And also the original RF kit amplifier. This is the backyard view. Here is the workshop downstairs. The studio where we are is up here right now. I have some directional loop antennas, some beverage antennas, and this right here is a diamond collinear for 2 meter and 70 centimeter, an excellent antenna. Works very well. And then I have some antenna switching as well going on for my receive antennas out back. So we're going to leave it at that. Let you out a little early tonight. Are there any questions before we go tonight? Let me go ahead and take the spotlight off so I can see you just a little bit better.
The one that you have in your garage, is that your hot water heater next to it?
It is. It's what they call a heat pump hot water heater.
Are you worried about what would happen if anything were to? Okay.
No, no.
As far as the RG58 or the RG213, do any of those go with antennas? And if so, what would be the best one to use?
Well, it depends on what frequency range you're going to be operating in. If you're going to be on VHF and UHF, if you can, RG213 or even better, LMR400 has lower loss at VHF and UHF. If you're just running, the two most popular cables that I use here are RG8X and RG213.
Okay.
Pretty much all of my cable is that, and it works fine.
Okay.
Cool. All right. Well, you've been very attentive tonight. I appreciate it very much. Go let your brain cool off. Take it easy. And until next week, let me say 73. See you next
Thank
time.
you much.